My daughter's laughter echoed through the courtroom, sharp and mocking, while her husband's eyes rolled with smug disdain. The jury whispered, restless, as the judge's voice cracked. "Are you insane? I won't try him." Everyone knew who I was. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The phone's alert pierced through the dawn silence of my Malibu villa like a blade through silk. My eyes snapped open to see the screen glowing with a news notification. Local court filings, Matthews versus Matthews. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, ceramic shattering against the Italian marble floor as I read my own name in the legal database. My daughter was suing me. The Pacific fog rolled in through the floor-to-ceiling windows as I stood frozen in my kitchen, watching my 30 years of federal judicial service flash before my eyes. Every case I'd presided over, every decision that earned respect in the legal community, now overshadowed by seeing my family name dragged through public court records. I pulled up the full documents on my tablet, my legal training kicking in despite the emotional earthquake. Property valuation, $4.2 million. Plaintiff representation, Henderson and Associates, specialists in aggressive family disputes. The filing date stared back at me from 3 days ago. 3 days, and I'd heard nothing directly from Wilma. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, each note echoing through rooms that suddenly felt too large, too empty. I'd bought this house when Wilma graduated Stanford, thinking about family gatherings, grandchildren running through these halls. Now those same halls witnessed my daughter's betrayal spelled out in legal terminology. Moving to my mahogany desk, I spread the documents across its polished surface. The magnifying glass revealed inconsistencies, property improvements listed that never happened, valuations that seemed inflated. My judicial mind cataloged each weakness while my father's heart cracked a little more. Bernard's number was still in my favorites from our law school days. His voice carried the same gravelly authority that had served him well in corporate law for 4 decades. "Alan, this is unexpected. Everything all right?" "Bernard, I need your expertise." My voice remained steady, controlled. "Hypothetically, if someone filed a property dispute against a federal judge, what would that suggest about their legal counsel? Hypothetically, it would suggest either supreme confidence or supreme desperation. Why do you ask?" I told him about the lawsuit, watching the morning light dance across the ocean waves beyond my terrace. Bernard's sharp intake of breath confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't standard family law practice. Henderson and Associates don't typically take cases against federal judges unless they're certain of winning or unless someone's paying them very well to try, he said. "Alan, this smells like outside influence." Outside influence. Neil's face materialized in my mind. My son-in-law, with his calculating eyes and quick smile. The man who'd swept Wilma off her feet during her vulnerable period after her mother's death. Who'd pushed for a quick wedding. Who'd immediately started asking questions about my estate planning. After hanging up with Bernard, I walked to the fireplace where silver-framed photographs chronicled happier times. Wilma's Stanford graduation, her wedding day, last Christmas dinner. In each recent photo, Neil's position grew more prominent, while Wilma seemed to shrink into his shadow. The eucalyptus trees outside my window swayed in the coastal breeze, their scent mixing with the salt air. This house had been my sanctuary, built with money earned through decades of service to justice. Now, it had become the center of a war I never wanted to fight. I moved to the window overlooking the Pacific, watching waves crash against the rocks below. The same methodical rhythm that had calmed me through countless difficult decisions now seemed to whisper strategies. If they wanted to treat this as a legal battle, they'd face a former federal judge who'd never lost his taste for justice. The day stretched ahead like a chessboard, each hour offering opportunities to gather intelligence, to understand my opponent's true motivations. I had work to do. The day passed slowly, each hour measured by the grandfather clock's chimes, as I researched Neil's background with the thoroughness that had defined my judicial career. By 6:30 that evening, I'd assembled a disturbing picture of my son-in-law's finances. 3 maxed credit cards, a failed real estate venture, and creditors circling like sharks. From my study window, I watched a battered sedan pull into my circular driveway. Not Wilma's usual Mercedes, but something cheap and desperate. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I positioned myself behind my desk deliberately. the same mahogany piece where I'd written judicial opinions that shaped federal precedent. The leather chair creaked as I settled in, arranging the lawsuit papers in neat stacks. The desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of authority I'd cultivated over decades. The doorbell's chime echoed through the villa. I waited exactly 30 seconds before answering, long enough to establish control, but not so long as to appear petty. Wilma entered first, her movements tentative, uncertain. She glanced around the foyer as if seeing it for the first time, her eyes lingering on details she'd grown up with. Neil followed close behind, his gaze immediately calculating, assessing. I watched him catalog the artwork, the furniture, the crystal chandelier, not with appreciation, but with the cold evaluation of an appraiser. "Dad." Wilma's voice carried guilt and defiance in equal measure. "Thank you for agreeing to see us." "My home is always open to my daughter," I replied, emphasis on the word daughter. "Please, come in. Can I offer you anything? Coffee? Something stronger?" Neil chose whiskey, expensive taste for a man with debt problems. Wilma declined everything, her hands twisting in her lap, as we settled in the living room. I'd arranged the seating carefully. Them on the cream sofa where the light from the window would illuminate their expressions, me in my leather chair where shadows would mask mine. "This doesn't have to be complicated, Alan," Neil began, his tone attempting warmth but missing by miles. "Wilma just wants what's fair, what her mother would have wanted." The mention of my deceased wife hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. Her mother would have wanted Wilma to be happy. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" Wilma's eyes flickered between Neil and me, confusion clouding her features. Yes, Dad. Neil takes good care of me." "I'm sure he does." I leaned back, studying them both. "Tell me, Neil, what do you think of the renovations I've made over the years? The pool area, for instance." His eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that revealed too much. "The infinity edge design is remarkable. Must have cost around $150 to install. And the updated electrical system from 2019, that adds significant value." I'd never mentioned the electrical work to anyone outside my contractor. The figure he quoted matched my actual expenses exactly. Information only available through a professional property assessment. "You seem quite knowledgeable about real estate values," I observed, my voice carrying the same tone I'd used when questioning witnesses who'd overplayed their hand. Neil's confidence faltered for just a moment. "Well, I've done some research. For the lawsuit, you understand." "Of course." I turned to Wilma. "Darling, do you remember your favorite room in this house when you were growing up?" She smiled for the first time since arriving. "The library. I used to curl up in that big chair and read for hours while you worked on cases." "And now?" Her smile faded. "Now, we think the house is too big for one person, too expensive to maintain." The words sounded rehearsed, hollow. This wasn't my daughter speaking. This was Neil's script delivered by an actress who'd forgotten her motivation. Neil leaned forward aggressively. "The property taxes alone are astronomical. Add utilities, maintenance, staff. It's wasteful for one person to tie up this much capital." "Capital?" I repeated the word slowly. Interesting choice of terminology. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Once, then again. The third buzz made him snatch it up, declining the call with angry jabs at the screen. But not before I caught the caller ID. First National Collections. "Popular man," I commented. "Business calls." His jaw tightened. "Look, Alan, let's cut to the chase. Wilma's entitled to half this property's value. We're prepared to settle for 40% if you cooperate." Cooperate. Another interesting word choice. "And if I don't?" "Then we proceed with the lawsuit. Public records, media attention, professional embarrassment." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A federal judge's family dispute makes good headlines." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. I looked at my daughter, seeing the conflict warring in her expression. She loved me. I could see it in the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes when Neil spoke. But she was trapped, manipulated by a man who had identified her vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. "I see." I stood slowly, moving to the window where the last light painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. "Well, this has been illuminating. I'll need time to consider your proposal." Neil's confidence returned. "Don't take too long. Legal fees accumulate quickly, and we both know how expensive family court can be. After they left, the villa settled into its evening quiet. I remained by the window, watching their sedan's taillights disappear down the coastal highway. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, but now they seemed to whisper of strategy, of careful moves in a game where the stakes were my daughter's soul. Moving to my study, I opened my laptop and began typing. If Neil wanted to play with legal fire, he'd discover that some judges never truly retire. They just choose their battles more carefully. 3 weeks of methodical preparation had transformed my study into something resembling a federal case room. Financial documents covered every surface. Surveillance photographs lined the walls, and color-coded timelines tracked Neil's escalating desperation. When I arrived at Bernard's Beverly Hills office that Tuesday afternoon, I carried 2 briefcases filled with evidence that would have impressed my former prosecutorial team. Bernard's mahogany-paneled office overlooked Wilshire Boulevard, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city where I'd once served justice. The conference table, an antique piece that had witnessed countless legal strategies, now hosted our war counsel. Detective Effie Richardson entered precisely at 2 o'clock, her laptop bag heavy with intelligence. A former LAPD financial crimes investigator turned private detective. She possessed the methodical thoroughness that federal cases demanded. "The debt picture is worse than we initially thought," she began, spreading documents across the polished surface. Neil Morrison owes $320,000 to First National Bank, $280,000 to a loan shark named Melvin Wagner, and another $200,000 across various credit cards. Bernard whistled low. $800,000 total. That's not gambling debt. That's systematic borrowing. Wagner's the concerning element here, Effie continued, opening her laptop to display surveillance photographs. He's not your typical neighborhood lender. This man has a reputation for aggressive collection methods, and he specializes in property seizures. The photographs showed Neil in parking lots, coffee shops, and back alley meetings. His body language screamed desperation. Hunched shoulders, constant phone checking, the nervous gestures of a man drowning in obligations. Timeline analysis reveals something interesting, I said, pulling out my own charts. Neil's courtship of Wilma began exactly 2 months after his first loan from Wagner. His marriage proposal coincided with his debt reaching critical mass. Effie nodded grimly. Your son-in-law researched your property's value 6 months before the wedding. I have records of his calls to 3 different appraisers. Bernard leaned forward, his corporate lawyer instincts engaged. That suggests premeditation. We could argue fraudulent inducement if he married Wilma under false pretenses. It's worse than that, I replied, remembering a case from 15 years earlier. In 2010, I presided over United States versus Morrison. No relation to Neil, different spelling. The defendant targeted wealthy widows and divorcees, using the same systematic approach. Establish emotional connection during vulnerability. Accelerate the relationship, then create financial pressure requiring asset liquidation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about my villa or even my daughter's happiness. Neil represented a pattern, a predator, who would continue targeting vulnerable people until someone stopped him. Wagner gave him 60 days, Effie added quietly. That timeline explains the lawsuit's urgency and Neil's pressure tactics on Wilma. Bernard shifted uncomfortably. Alan, we should focus on defending the property claim. Building a criminal case against Neil is beyond our scope. No. My voice carried the authority of 3 decades on the federal bench. Defensive strategies protect one victim while allowing the predator to find others. This requires offensive action. I stood and walked to the window, watching traffic flow along Wilshire Boulevard like pieces on a chessboard. Each vehicle followed predictable patterns, just as Neil's desperation would drive him toward increasingly poor decisions. We're going to let the case proceed to court, I announced. But we're not going there as defendants. We're going as prosecutors. Bernard's eyes widened. Alan, that's not how civil litigation works. It is when you control the narrative and the information flow, I replied, turning back to face them. Effie, I need complete financial records on Wagner's other clients. Bernard, research every property case Henderson and Associates has filed in the past 5 years. Look for patterns. What about Wilma? Bernard asked. She's caught in the middle of this. Wilma is a victim who doesn't yet understand she's been victimized, I said, my heart aching for my daughter while my mind remained focused on strategy. The kindest thing I can do for her is expose the truth before she loses everything to this man. Effie closed her laptop with a decisive snap. I'll need 2 weeks for comprehensive background work on Wagner's network. You have 1 week, I corrected. After that, we begin phase 2. Bernard gathered the scattered documents, his movements reflecting the lawyer's instinct to organize chaos into manageable strategy. What exactly is phase 2? I picked up my phone, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in months. Judge Gordon Wagner, no relation to the loan shark, but a longtime colleague whose courthouse assignment rotations could prove crucial. Information warfare, I said, finger poised over the call button. If Neil wants to play in the legal arena, he'll discover that some of us never truly retire from the game. The phone began to ring as I prepared to make my first strategic contact. 2 weeks of careful positioning had passed since that afternoon in Bernard's office. The phone call to Judge Wagner had been the opening move in a campaign that would have made my federal prosecution team proud. Now, standing in the Jonathan Club's leather-appointed dining room, I surveyed the battlefield I'd spent a lifetime learning to navigate. Judge Wagner occupied our usual corner table, his silver hair catching the subdued lighting, as he studied the menu with the same attention he brought to legal briefs. Gordon had presided over federal cases for 28 years, and his understanding of legal strategy ran deeper than most attorneys ever achieved. The Dover sole is excellent today, he mentioned, as I settled into the burgundy leather banquette. Though I suspect you didn't invite me here for culinary recommendations. You're right, as usual, I replied, signaling the waiter for our regular orders. I need perspective on a delicate family situation that might require judicial oversight. Over the next hour, I outlined Neil's scheme without revealing the personal stakes. To Gordon, this appeared as a concerned colleague seeking advice about an elder exploitation case that had landed on his desk. His reactions provided valuable intelligence about how the legal community would view the evidence. Cases like this make my blood boil, Gordon said, cutting his fish with precise movements. Financial predators target vulnerability with surgical precision. The emotional manipulation component makes prosecution challenging, but not impossible. What would you recommend for case management? I asked, knowing his answer would influence my strategy. Fast-track scheduling, comprehensive financial discovery, and immediate asset protection orders, he replied without hesitation. These defendants rely on prolonged proceedings to exhaust their victims emotionally and financially. 5 days later, the Beverly Hills Hotel's Grand Ballroom hosted the annual Legal Aid Society Charity Gala. 300 attorneys, judges, and court administrators mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their conversations creating an information marketplace more valuable than any stock exchange. I worked the room systematically, carrying myself with the dignity that 30 years of federal service had earned. Each conversation planted seeds carefully. Concern about elder exploitation trends, mentions of sophisticated financial fraud cases, subtle warnings about predators targeting the recently bereaved. Alan, I heard you're dealing with some family legal matters, commented Rebecca Torres, Chief Court Administrator for Los Angeles County Superior Court. Her access to scheduling and case assignment made her friendship invaluable. Nothing I can't handle, I replied with practiced nonchalance, though I'm concerned about a disturbing trend of financial manipulation targeting families during vulnerable periods. The Morrison case? She asked, confirming that news of the lawsuit had reached court administrative levels. Among others, these schemes seem to follow predictable patterns once you understand the methodology. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in Santa Monica, Neil paced his apartment's cramped living room while Wilma watched with growing unease. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from Wagner's associates, pressure from legitimate creditors, increasingly desperate attempts to expedite the legal proceedings. Why can't we just ask Dad for help directly? Wilma asked for the 3rd time that week. He's always been generous with family financial needs. Neil's jaw tightened. Your father's generosity comes with strings attached. The lawsuit protects your rights independently. But Wilma had found the real estate evaluation documents hidden in Neil's desk drawer. Properties don't require professional appraisals unless someone intends to sell them, and her father's villa had been assessed twice in the past 6 months. The final piece of my networking campaign took place at a Century City cafe, where I'd arranged to encounter Margaret Kim, the court clerk responsible for case scheduling. Our chance meeting lasted exactly long enough for me to express concerns about rushed family law proceedings and the importance of thorough discovery periods. Some attorneys push for expedited hearings when clients need time to understand complex financial implications, I mentioned while stirring my coffee, especially in cases involving older adults and valuable properties. Margaret nodded knowingly. We see that pattern frequently. Aggressive scheduling requests often indicate problems with the underlying claims. 2 weeks of strategic conversations had achieved their purpose. The legal community now understood that the Morrison versus Matthews case involved more than simple family disputes. Whispers of financial manipulation and predatory behavior would influence everything from case assignment to procedural decisions. My phone buzzed with a text message from Effie. Wagner's enforcement team contacted Neil twice today. Photos attached show stress levels increasing. Time to proceed to next phase. I excused myself from the networking conversation and stepped onto Century City's windswept plaza. The urban canyon of office towers stretched toward the Pacific, each building representing thousands of legal battles fought and won through superior strategy and information control. Bernard's number connected on the first ring. "It's time," I said simply. "Schedule the meeting with Henderson and Associates." Neil's about to discover that some games have consequences his desperation never anticipated. 2 weeks of strategic positioning had passed since my Century City encounter with Margaret Kim. The legal community's whispers about elder exploitation had reached exactly the right ears, and Neil's desperation had escalated predictably. His increasingly frantic calls to Wilma, demanding updates on the case's progress, had not gone unnoticed by my daughter. The drive to Santa Monica carried me through familiar territory, but today's journey felt different. Where once I'd traveled this route to visit my daughter's happiness, now I navigated toward a confrontation designed to expose the parasite destroying her life. Their apartment complex stood in stark contrast to my Malibu villa, 2-bedroom units with aluminum siding and a shared parking lot. The building's modest appearance reinforced everything my investigation had revealed about Neil's true financial situation. Wilma opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The strain of recent weeks showed in the tightness around her mouth, the way her hands moved nervously when she spoke. "Dad, thank you for coming. Neil's making lunch." The apartment's interior revealed more than any financial document could. Rental furniture, generic artwork, and the unmistakable atmosphere of people living beyond their means. On the side table, partially hidden beneath a magazine, loan documents bore Wagner's logo. Neil emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron and forced enthusiasm. "Alan, great to see you. I made your favorite, grilled salmon with that lemon sauce you mentioned loving." Interesting. I'd never mentioned any food preferences to Neil, but desperation made people create connections that didn't exist. We settled around their small dining table, the formal place settings, incongruous with the apartment's humble furnishings. Neil's phone lay face down beside his plate, but its constant buzzing created an undercurrent of tension. "I've been thinking about our situation," I began, cutting into the overcooked fish. "Perhaps we can reach an understanding without involving the courts." Wilma perked up immediately. "Dad, that would be wonderful. This whole legal process feels so unnecessary." Neil's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What kind of understanding?" $500,000, cash, immediate transfer." I delivered the figure with the same matter-of-fact tone I'd once used to announce federal sentences. No lawyers, no court proceedings, no public records. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Wilma's eyes widened with what looked like relief, but Neil's expression hardened into something calculating and greedy. 500? Neil's voice carried disbelief and barely contained anger. "Alan, the property's appraised value is $4.2 million. Half of that belongs to Wilma." "According to whose appraisal?" I asked quietly. Neil's face flushed. "According to standard market evaluations. Your daughter deserves her fair share of the family estate." "Her fair share," I repeated, setting down my fork with deliberate precision. "Tell me, Neil, what do you consider fair about a man who researched my property's value 6 months before proposing to my daughter?" The color drained from his face. Wilma looked between us, confusion clouding her features. "Dad, what are you talking about? Your husband had my villa professionally appraised while he was courting you, sweetheart. Before he proposed, before he claimed to love you, He knew exactly what our family assets were worth. Neil's phone buzzed again. This time he couldn't ignore it. The caller ID showed Wagner Enterprises in bold letters. His hands shook as he declined the call. That's business research, he stammered. Understanding family financial situations is responsible planning. For a marriage or a robbery? I asked. The phone buzzed again immediately. Neil excused himself, stepping onto the apartment's small balcony to take the call. Through the sliding glass door, I could see his animated gestures, the way he paced in tight circles while speaking. Alone with Wilma for the first time in months, I watched my daughter's careful composure begin to crack. "Dad, I don't understand what's happening," she whispered. "Neil says you're trying to cheat me out of my inheritance, but $500,000 sounds like more money than I could ever need." "Your mother and I saved every penny to ensure your security," I replied, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "But security isn't about money, sweetheart. It's about being surrounded by people who love you for who you are, not what you own." On the balcony, Neil's conversation grew more animated. His free hand gestured frantically, while his voice rose to levels audible through the glass. "I need more time." The words carried clearly into the apartment. $2 million is reasonable. The old man will pay to avoid embarrassment. My daughter's face went pale as the implications sank in. For the first time since this nightmare began, Wilma was hearing her husband's true motivations in his own words. Neil ended the call and returned to the table, his expression carefully neutral, despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Sorry about that. Business call." "Of course," I replied, noting how his eyes avoided Wilma's gaze. "So, have you considered my offer?" $500,000 is insulting," he said, his mask of civility slipping. "We'll proceed with the lawsuit. The courts will ensure Wilma receives justice." "Justice?" I stood slowly, my hate casting shadows across their small table. Interesting choice of words from a man who owes $800,000 to people who don't negotiate. 3 weeks had passed since that illuminating lunch in Santa Monica. Neil's increasingly desperate phone calls to Wilma had intensified, each conversation revealing more of his true nature. My daughter's growing silence told me she was finally seeing the man she'd married for, who he really was. The drive to Beverly Hills took me through morning traffic that moved with the predictable rhythm of a city unaware of the chess game reaching its climax. In 1 week, our case would go to trial. Today I would make my final strategic move. Alma Santos had served as my notary for 15 years, handling everything from property transfers to complex estate planning. Her office on Wilshire Boulevard occupied the ground floor of a building that had witnessed countless legal dramas, but none as personally significant as today's session. "Judge Matthews," Alma greeted me with professional warmth tinged by concern. "Your request for an emergency will revision surprise me. Such comprehensive changes require careful consideration." "I've had months to consider," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from her mahogany desk. "Recent events have clarified my priorities regarding family legacy." The documents I'd prepared were thorough and devastating. Every asset, every investment, every penny of my federal judge's pension, all redirected away from family inheritance toward charitable organizations. The Stanford Law School Scholarship Fund, the Federal Judges Retirement Foundation, the Malibu Coastal Conservation Trust. "You're removing your daughter entirely from the estate?" Alma asked, her professional composure not quite hiding her shock. "A father cannot support his daughter's choices when those choices involve enabling fraud and manipulation," I explained, my voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "Wilma has chosen to pursue legal action based on false pretenses. I cannot reward that behavior with inheritance." Alma reviewed each page meticulously, her legal training evident in how she examined every clause and contingency. "This represents a complete reversal of your previous estate planning. Are you certain about these changes?" "Absolutely certain. The trial begins next week, and I want these changes legally binding before any court proceedings commence." She prepared the final documents with professional efficiency, but I could see the questions in her eyes. A federal judge didn't make such drastic decisions lightly, and the legal community would certainly take notice of this development. "There is one addition," I said, producing a sealed envelope from my briefcase. "A personal letter to be placed in my safety deposit box, instructions for my daughter to be opened only after my death." Alma accepted the envelope without comment, though I knew her curiosity was piqued. The letter contained my true feelings for Wilma, my understanding of her manipulation by Neil, and my hope that she would eventually break free from his influence. But she didn't need to know that now. The notarization process took 45 minutes. Each signature, each stamp, each witness mark created legal reality from strategic fiction. By the time we finished, Alan Matthews' estate no longer included provisions for his daughter's inheritance. "Judge, if I may ask," Alma hesitated, then continued with professional concern. "Is there any possibility of reconciliation with your family?" "That depends entirely on whether my daughter chooses family over fortune hunters," I replied, standing to leave. "Some lessons require difficult consequences." As I gathered my documents, Alma's legal secretary entered to retrieve court filings. Linda Chen had worked in Beverly Hills legal offices for 20 years, and her network of professional relationships made her an invaluable source of legal community gossip. "Oh my," Linda said, noting the will revision documents. "Judge Matthews, I hope everything is all right with your family." "Family situations can be complicated," I replied with calculated resignation. "Sometimes parents must make difficult decisions to protect their children from poor choices." Linda's eyes widened with understanding. Within hours, this conversation would circulate through the legal community's informal network. By evening, word would reach Neil through his attorney about the complete estate revision. The psychological pressure would be devastating. Neil's entire scheme depended on eventual inheritance prospects. Learning that his lawsuit had triggered the complete elimination of Wilma's future wealth would destroy his remaining strategic options. I left Alma's office knowing that information about the will change would reach Neil before sunset. His creditors were expecting resolution within days, and discovering that his legal strategy had backfired catastrophically would force him into increasingly desperate actions. The countdown to trial had begun, but the real battle would be won in the next 24 hours when Neil realized that his manipulation had cost Wilma everything he'd tried to steal. My phone buzzed with a message from Bernard. "Trial preparation meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Are you ready for the final confrontation?" I checked my watch, 2:47 p.m. By this time tomorrow, Neil would know that his scheme had destroyed the very fortune he'd tried to claim. The final act of this drama would begin with his discovery that greed had consumed its own reward. The phone call reached Neil at exactly 6 p.m., 3 days before our scheduled court appearance. I knew this because Linda Chen's network operated with Swiss watch precision, and strategic information moved through Beverly Hills legal circles faster than wildfire through dry brush. From my Malibu study, I could almost feel the earthquake that call would trigger in their cramped Santa Monica apartment. 20 years of federal judicial experience had taught me that desperate people make predictable mistakes when pressure reaches critical mass. Wilma answered her phone on the fourth ring, her voice thick with tears. "Dad, I need to ask you something important." "Of course, sweetheart. What's troubling you?" "Neil says you changed your will. He says you cut me out completely because of the lawsuit." Her voice broke on the last words. "Is that true?" I let the silence stretch, allowing her pain to register fully before responding with measured calm. "Legal documents reflect our choices, Wilma. Actions have consequences." "But I never wanted to hurt you. Neil said this was about protecting my rights, about what Mom would have wanted." Through the phone, I could hear Neil's voice in the background, urgent and demanding. Then a door slammed. "He just left," Wilma whispered. "Dad, I found something in his briefcase. Papers about loans, about debts I never knew existed. $800,000. My heart clenched for my daughter, finally seeing the trap that had ensnared her. "Tell me what you found, sweetheart." Documents from someone named Wagner, threatening letters, and the dates. Her voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "Dad, the first loan was taken out 2 weeks before Neil asked me on our first date." The timeline that had been clear to me for months was finally becoming visible to her. Neil's courtship hadn't been romance. It had been reconnaissance. "There's more," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Real estate appraisals for your house. 3 different companies, all contacted before our engagement." I closed my eyes, feeling both vindication and heartbreak. My daughter was finally seeing the truth, but the cost had been devastating. "Wilma, where is Neil now?" "He said he had to meet someone about the money situation. He was angry, scared. He kept saying the lawsuit had to settle immediately, or we'd lose everything. Everything. Not her inheritance, not our relationship, his financial salvation. Dad, what do I do? My marriage, the lawsuit, everything feels like it's built on lies. You do what you've always done, sweetheart. You choose truth over convenience, integrity over easy answers. That's who your mother and I raised you to be. Neil, meanwhile, was speeding through Los Angeles traffic toward a warehouse district meeting he'd arranged in desperation. Yagner's enforcement team had made their final demands clear. Payment in full, or asset seizure, beginning with whatever property claims Neil could deliver. The loan shark's office occupied a converted shipping container behind a legitimate trucking company. Wagner himself, a thick-set man with calculating eyes, didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your father-in-law's will change creates complications, Wagner said, lighting a cigarette despite California's indoor smoking laws. No inheritance means no collateral for extended payment terms. The lawsuit will still provide settlement funds, Neil insisted, sweat beading despite the office's air conditioning. Settlement requires cooperation. Federal judges don't typically cooperate with schemes targeting their families. Neil's world was crumbling with each word. The will change had destroyed his long-term strategy, and Wagner's patience had evaporated entirely. I need more time, 2 weeks maximum. Wagner's laugh held no humor. You have until tomorrow's court hearing. Deliver settlement papers or face immediate collection procedures. Back in Santa Monica, Wilma was discovering more evidence of Neil's deception. His laptop, left open in his haste to meet Wagner, contained emails stretching back 18 months, messages to dating sites describing his ideal target. Financially secure, recently bereaved, emotionally vulnerable. Her marriage had been a business transaction. The phone rang again, Neil calling from his car. Don't touch my computer, he demanded without preamble, and don't call your father again. This situation requires careful handling. I know about the dating profiles, Wilma said quietly. The silence on the line stretched like a taut wire before Neil's voice returned, cold and calculating. Everyone has a past, Wilma. What matters is our future. The settlement will solve our problems and secure our relationship. Our problems or your debts? Same thing, Neil snapped, his mask finally slipping completely. Marriage is a partnership. Your family's assets become our assets. That's how these things work. Wilma hung up and immediately called me back. Dad, I want to withdraw the lawsuit, tonight, before tomorrow's hearing. But even as she spoke, Neil was already racing back to their apartment, Wagner's ultimatum echoing in his ears. Tomorrow's court appearance had become a life-or-death moment, and desperate men rarely accepted defeat gracefully. Morning fog clung to the Los Angeles County Courthouse steps as I climbed toward 20 years of memories. This building had been my professional home, where I had presided over federal cases that shaped legal precedent. Today I would enter not as a judge, but as a defendant in my own family's destruction. The irony wasn't lost on me. Bernard waited in the marble lobby, his expression mixing professional confidence with personal concern. The legal community is buzzing about this case. Half the courthouse knows your name is on today's docket. Good, I replied, adjusting my tie with the same precision I'd used for 2 decades of judicial appearances. Let them watch. We rode the elevator to the 3rd floor in silence, but I could feel the weight of history in these familiar walls. Courtroom 312 had hosted some of my most significant rulings. Judge Gordon Wagner would preside today, a colleague who'd witnessed my judicial career from its beginning. The courtroom filled quickly. Legal proceedings involving federal judges drew professional curiosity like magnets attract metal. Court clerks, bailiffs, and attorneys who'd argued before me over the years filed into the gallery seats. Neil and his attorney occupied the plaintiff's table, Henderson's aggressive demeanor at odds with the solemn atmosphere. Wilma sat behind them, her face pale but determined. She'd refused Neil's demands to dress celebratory for their expected victory. At precisely 9:30, I entered the courtroom. The reaction was immediate and electric. Every legal professional in attendance recognized me instantly. The federal judge who'd spent 2 decades in this building, earning respect for fairness and judicial integrity. Whispers rippled through the gallery like wind through wheat. That's Judge Matthews. 20 years on the federal bench. Why is he being sued by his own family? Judge Wagner's gavel froze halfway to the bench as our eyes met. Gordon's expression shifted from professional neutrality to personal shock, then to something approaching dismay. Neil turned to see what had caused the disturbance, his face showing confusion at the courtroom's buzzing energy. Henderson and Associates had apparently failed to research their opponent's background beyond basic property records. "Your Honor," Henderson began, but Wagner raised his hand for silence. "Counselor, are you representing claims against Federal Judge Alan Matthews?" "Yes, Your Honor. Property dispute involving family assets and—" "Stop." Wagner's voice carried decades of judicial authority. "This court cannot hear cases involving federal judicial colleagues without proper administrative review." The gallery's whispers intensified. Neil's face reddened as he realized something significant was happening, though he couldn't grasp exactly what. Judge Wagner continued, his tone formal but strained. "Given the professional relationships involved, this court must recuse itself from hearing Matthews versus Matthews. The case will be transferred to Orange County Superior Court for unbiased adjudication." Henderson stood awkwardly. "Your Honor, we object to any delays. Our client requires immediate—" "The objection is noted and overruled," Wagner replied sharply. "This court will not compromise judicial ethics for scheduling convenience." I remained silent throughout the exchange, observing Wilma's growing comprehension as she watched the legal community's reaction to my presence. Her father wasn't just any defendant. He was a respected member of the judicial family these people had served for decades. A court clerk leaned toward her neighbor. "Judge Matthews sentenced my brother's dealer to federal prison. Fair but firm. Saved his life, probably." Another whispered, "Remember the Morrison case? Judge Matthews exposed that financial predator targeting elderly widows." Wilma's eyes found mine across the courtroom, understanding finally dawning in her expression. The man Neil had portrayed as an obstinate, greedy father was actually someone the entire legal system treated with professional reverence. Judge Wagner called a 15-minute recess to arrange case transfer. As the courtroom buzzed with conversation, I watched Neil's growing frustration compete with his confusion. His timeline was collapsing, but he couldn't understand why everyone treated his lawsuit with such gravity. "This is ridiculous theater," Neil muttered to Henderson, loud enough for nearby observers to hear. "He's just an old man trying to avoid paying what he owes." The nearby court reporter's face showed shock at such disrespect toward a federal judge. Word of Neil's attitude would spread through the courthouse like ripples in still water. Wilma approached me during the recess, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I had no idea. About your reputation, your standing here, Neil made it sound like I was just another aging father hoarding family wealth," I completed gently. She nodded, tears threatening. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For doubting you. For not seeing what Neil really was." Judge Wagner returned to announce the case transfer would require 2 weeks minimum. Neil's face went white as his Wagner ultimatum deadline evaporated. The courtroom began to empty, but the legal community's protective circle around me remained visible. These people had witnessed my judicial service, and their respect created an invisible barrier around my family's dignity. As we gathered our materials, I noticed Neil on his phone in the hallway, his voice desperate. 2 weeks minimum delay. I know what you said, but the judge recused himself because the countdown to his reckoning had accelerated beyond his control. The courthouse corridors buzzed with whispered conversations that followed me like ripples in still water. Court clerks nodded respectfully as I passed, their recognition carrying weight that 20 years of federal service had earned. Judge Wagner's refusal to hear the case had sent shockwaves through the legal community, and now everyone understood what Neil had failed to grasp. Judge Etta Willis agreed to oversee the case transfer, her chambers becoming the stage for Neil's final desperate performance. The oak-paneled walls had witnessed countless legal dramas, but few as personally revealing as today's proceedings. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Willis addressed Neil with professional courtesy, tinged by growing concern. "Do you understand why Judge Wagner recused himself from your case?" Neil's jaw tightened with stubborn frustration. "Your Honor, this appears to be professional favoritism. My wife deserves equal treatment under the law, regardless of her father's connections." Bernard leaned forward from his position beside me. "Your Honor, the plaintiff seems unaware that Judge Matthews served with distinction on the federal bench for 2 decades, including 15 years in this very building." The revelation hit Neil like cold water. His attorney, Daniel Henderson, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally grasping the magnitude of his client's miscalculation. "Federal judge?" Neil's voice cracked slightly. That changes nothing. Family law is family law." Judge Willis reviewed the case files with growing dismay. "Mr. Henderson, your firm filed suit against a respected federal colleague without researching his professional background?" Henderson's face flushed crimson. "Your Honor, our client represented the defendant as a retired businessman with property holdings. The Federal Judicial Service wasn't disclosed during initial consultations." "Because he didn't think it was relevant," Neil interjected angrily. "Rich is rich, regardless of how the money was earned." The courtroom fell silent at Neil's crude assessment. Judge Willis's expression hardened with professional disapproval. "Mr. Morrison, federal judges dedicate their careers to upholding justice and protecting vulnerable citizens. The legal community takes seriously any allegations against our colleagues." Henderson requested a private consultation with his client. 10 minutes later, they returned with Henderson looking deeply troubled. "Your Honor, I must withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff. Ethical considerations prevent my continued representation in this matter." Neil's face went white. "You can't abandon me now. We had an agreement." "Professional ethics supersede client agreements," Henderson replied firmly. "I suggest you seek representation from an attorney willing to proceed against a federal judge." The implications were devastating. No reputable attorney would touch a case that the legal community viewed as harassment of a respected colleague. Neil's scheme was collapsing under the weight of institutional respect for judicial integrity. Meanwhile, Wilma sat in the courthouse waiting area, processing revelations that reframed her entire understanding of recent events. Court personnel approached her with gentle sympathy. "Your father's a good man," an elderly bailiff told her quietly. "Tough but fair. Seen him protect folks from exactly this kind of situation." "What kind of situation?" Wilma asked. "Financial predators targeting families during vulnerable times. Your dad specialized in those cases." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Neil hadn't just manipulated her emotionally. He'd followed patterns that her father had spent decades prosecuting. Back in Judge Willis's chambers, Neil made one final desperate plea. "This is all theater designed to intimidate us into dropping legitimate claims. Wilma deserves her inheritance." "Mr. Morrison," Judge Willis replied with ice-cold professionalism, "inheritance implies death. Judge Matthews is very much alive and entitled to control his own assets." Neil's phone buzzed insistently. Wagner's associates had been monitoring court proceedings, and news of the case's collapse was already reaching creditor networks. His final gambit had not only failed, it had publicly exposed his scheme. "I need immediate settlement discussions," Neil demanded, "before any delays allow asset hiding." "There will be no settlement discussions," I spoke for the first time since entering chambers. "My daughter will make her own decisions about this lawsuit, free from your financial pressure." Wilma appeared in the doorway, having overheard our conversation. "Dad, I want to withdraw the lawsuit, completely and permanently." Neil spun toward her with desperate fury. "Wilma, you don't understand the implications. Without this settlement, we lose everything." "No," she replied with quiet strength. "You lose everything. I'm choosing my family." Judge Willis prepared the preliminary withdrawal documents while Neil stormed from chambers, his phone already ringing with creditor demands. Through the window, I watched him pace the courthouse parking lot, gesticulating wildly at invisible enemies. 20 years of judicial experience had taught me that justice often works through natural consequences rather than direct intervention. Neil's greed had destroyed his own scheme more effectively than any legal strategy I could have devised. Wilma signed the withdrawal papers with steady hands, her signature ending months of family warfare. As we prepared to leave chambers, she turned to Judge Willis. "Your Honor, I owe my father an apology for doubting his character." "Family relationships can be complicated," Judge Willis replied gently. "What matters is learning from our mistakes." Outside in the corridor, I watched Neil through tall windows as he argued desperately with unseen creditors. His isolation was complete. No legal representation, no family support, no creditor patience. The system had protected itself naturally, and justice had prevailed through institutional integrity rather than personal vengeance. My reputation had served as both shield and sword, defeating Neil's scheme without compromising my own principles. 2 weeks passed quietly in my Malibu villa, while Wilma processed the courthouse revelations and began disentangling herself from Neil's web of deception. I resisted the paternal urge to call her immediately, understanding that genuine healing required her independent choice to rebuild our relationship. The sunset painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson as I prepared dinner on the terrace, setting 2 places with cautious optimism: Wilma's favorite salmon, the wine her mother had loved, and fresh flowers from the garden that had always brought her comfort. At 7 o'clock precisely, I heard her car in the driveway. She approached the terrace hesitantly, her eyes taking in the carefully prepared table and the familiar surroundings she'd grown up cherishing. The past months had aged her, but I could see strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. "Dad, thank you for giving me space to think." "You needed time to process everything without pressure from either direction," I replied, pouring wine into crystal glasses that had been wedding gifts to her mother and me. We sat as the ocean breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus and salt air between us. For several minutes, we ate in comfortable silence, both gathering courage for necessary conversations. "I owe you an enormous apology," Wilma began, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "For doubting your character, for believing Neil's manipulations, for pursuing that lawsuit against everything you taught me about integrity. Sweetheart, you were targeted by someone who studied psychological manipulation professionally. Neil identified your vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. But I should have seen through it. Should have trusted you over a man I'd known for less than 2 years." I reached across the table to cover her hand with mine. Love makes us vulnerable to people who understand how to weaponize our emotions. It's not a character flaw. It's human nature. "Tell me about your career," she asked quietly. "Your real career, not the retired businessman story I somehow convinced myself was true." Over the next hour, I shared details of my professional life that I'd never discussed with family. Federal cases involving financial predators who targeted wealthy widows and divorcees. Schemes identical to Neil's approach. Establish emotional connections during vulnerable periods. Accelerate relationships. Then create financial pressure requiring asset liquidation. In 2010, I presided over United States versus Morrison. Different spelling, same methodology. The defendant had targeted 6 different women over 8 years, always following Neil's exact pattern. Wilma's face paled as understanding deepened. "So you recognized what was happening to me from professional experience. From the moment Neil mentioned my property's electrical upgrades, I knew he'd researched the house before proposing. The timeline confirmed predatory targeting. Why didn't you just tell me directly?" "Because manipulation victims rarely believe accusations against their manipulators until they discover evidence independently. Direct confrontation usually drives them deeper into the manipulator's control." As darkness settled over the Pacific, I retrieved an envelope from my briefcase, the sealed letter I'd placed in the bank's safety deposit box. "I want you to read this now, rather than waiting for my death." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter and read my explanation of the will change. The document revealed my true feelings: love, concern, and understanding of her manipulation, combined with strategic thinking designed to protect her from Neil's ultimate financial control. "The will change was never permanent," she whispered. "It was psychological warfare designed to destroy Neil's timeline and force his creditors to pressure him into mistakes. You were never truly disinherited." Tears flowed freely now, months of guilt and confusion finally releasing. "I'm so sorry, Dad, for everything." "You have nothing to apologize for, except perhaps trusting too easily. That's a beautiful quality that shouldn't be destroyed by one predator's abuse." We talked until midnight, rebuilding bridges that manipulation had damaged. I explained my estate planning philosophy: assets distributed based on demonstrated character and wisdom rather than automatic entitlement. "Neil taught me that money without wisdom creates vulnerability rather than security," Wilma said. "I want to learn how to protect myself and potentially help other women avoid similar manipulation. We could establish a foundation focused on elder and family exploitation prevention," I suggested. "Turn your painful experience into community protection." As we cleared the dinner dishes together, Wilma asked about Neil's current situation. "His creditors moved quickly once the lawsuit collapsed. Wagner's associates don't negotiate with failed schemes. Neil declared bankruptcy last week. And our marriage? I suspect he'll file for divorce once he realizes you're no longer a financial asset. Predators abandon targets who become liabilities. Standing on the terrace under star-filled skies, my daughter and I looked out over the Pacific, where waves continued their eternal rhythm. The crisis had tested our relationship, but ultimately strengthened it through truth and mutual respect. I love you, Dad, for your patience, your wisdom, and your forgiveness. I love you too, sweetheart. Welcome home. The villa that had nearly been lost to greed and manipulation would remain in our family, but more importantly, our family bonds had been restored through justice, patience, and the natural consequences of choosing integrity over convenience. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.